Hello and welcome to Portal Behind the Scenes. This is where we take you behind the pages of the Portal Journal and we give you insight from our authors and the research that they're conducting, as well as interviews with our editors so you can gain insight into the work that they do for Portal. I'm Stephen Bell and I am the Portal social media editor, and I work at Temple University Libraries. And with me today is my fellow Portal editor, Elisa Cahoy.
Hi, everybody. This is Elisa Cahoy, and I am with Stephen. I am also a social media editor for Portal and a member of the editorial board. And I work in the Penn State Libraries as an education librarian and assistant director of the Pennsylvania Center for the Book. Nice to be here with you today, Stephen.
Yes, thanks for joining us, Elisa. In this episode of Portal Behind the Scenes, we're chatting with Stefanie Bluemle. Stefanie is the research and instruction librarian and instruction coordinator at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. Let me say a little bit about Stefanie and why we're interviewing her today. Stefanie's article, Post Facts, Information Literacy and Authority After the 2016 Election, was selected as the best article published in the 2018 volume of Portal Libraries and the Academy.
Yay.
I'll also mention that Stefanie's article was awarded the ACRL Instruction Session Eileen F. Rockman Publication of the Year Award. So that's pretty amazing, Stefanie, that your article was the recipient of both of those awards in the same year. And I think that speaks volumes about the impression that your research and your article made on your peers. So congratulations on not only winning the Portal Article Award, but also the ACRL Instruction Section Award. So welcome, Stefanie. We're honored to have you as our guest today. And could you start us off by sharing your concept of post-facts and how this challenges our traditional concept of authority in librarianship?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to start off just by saying thank you to both of you for having me here today, and thank you to Portal for the award. It was quite an honor and a surprise, I will say, to receive that in addition to the Rockman Award. So I don't think I ever expected this article to receive as much attention as it has. The concept of post-facts, as I use it in this article, is a component of the larger concept of post-truth, which I think we've been talking about much more extensively, not just in librarianship, of course, but sort of across the US in the past couple of years. So we tend to think of post-truth as being a situation, or post-truth politics, as being a situation in which emotions or what we tend to feel to be true takes precedence over any kind of verifiable truth or evidentiary truth. In using the concept post-facts, I really wanted to narrow down to a component of that I thought had not been addressed quite enough, particularly in librarianship, which is the idea that a lot of this post-truth mindset comes from a really deep distrust in American culture of political and cultural elites. And as it happens, those elites are often the same people and organizations that are responsible for providing information to the American public. So for example, academics, experts of all kinds, colleges and universities, government organizations, which of course are responsible for many different things, but providing information is one of them, and the mainstream news media. And I think this is a tendency that has been around in the US for quite some time, but certainly the presidential campaign and then now the governing strategy of President Trump has, I think, really brought this out into the open and legitimated this kind of thinking in ways that it hadn't been even just a few years ago. So to me, this really challenges our traditional notion of authority in librarianship, because it seems to me that we still often, I mean, not always by any means, but we still often have a tendency to kind of to think of authority as something that is a characteristic of a source of information. And the problem that this poses is that we're currently in a situation where even a source of information that that tries to maintain fidelity to the facts insofar as they can be ascertained, a source of information that is committed to accuracy insofar as it can be committed to accuracy, a source of information that's dedicated to providing high quality information, that's dedicated to providing a sound argument, is often the very same type of information in which many people in the country refuse to place any level of authority, or are very reluctant to place any level of authority. And so that disconnect, I think, poses a problem for the way that we teach, say, the evaluation of sources in information literacy. And that's really what I wanted to address with the article.
All right, thanks for your response. There's no question that based on what happened after the election and moving forward and all the concerns now with potential for misinformation for 2020, we need to adapt our methods to that environment.
So building on that, Stefanie, in your article, you stated that librarianship's guiding document on authority in information literacy, which is the ACRL framework for information literacy, doesn't prepare us to teach in a post-facts United States. So in your opinion, you know, to build on what you and Stephen were just talking about, if we want to teach this in the classroom, how does the framework need to change in this area?
Well, in the article, I really addressed just one component of the framework, which is the frame called Authority is Constructed and Contextual. And I will say that I agree with the title of that frame. But I find that in doing a close reading of the text of the frame, the full description, there are still places where it speaks of authority as something that can be inherent in a source, similarly to the way that I mentioned just a moment ago. So for example, there's a place where it seems to kind of conflate expertise with authority, as though a source of information, say the author of which has expertise, will be an authoritative source. There are points where it suggests that learners, like beginning learners, can look for certain indicators of authority in sources. And to me, the word indicators suggests that that's something within the source that they can find. So for example, the credentials of the author, I think, is an example that pops up in the text of the frame. But there again, that's a characteristic of the source. So it seems to me that a close reading suggests that it doesn't fully commit to the definition that it suggests. I would love to see a situation, even within librarianship, where we start to decouple the concept of credibility from the concept of authority. And the way I'm using the word credibility right here is, I mean, maybe a very particular definition, but credibility being, say, the extent to which a source is committed to accuracy, the extent to which a source is committed to representing the facts insofar as they can be determined, the extent to which a source is committed to providing high quality information, to providing a well-reasoned argument substantiated by evidence, and so on. I think we should be thinking of authority not so much as which sources we should be trusting, but which sources we actually are trusting and why. And I think defining it that way allows us to continue to acknowledge that, say, in academic circles, for example, authority is constructed based on things like an author's expertise, the reputation of a journal, research methods, peer review, and so on. That those things are all hugely important to the construction of authority in academics, and we can talk about that. But it also allows us to talk about any number of other things that also go into the construction of authority for human beings in general. So things like our emotions, partisan affiliation, the values that we hold and that we look for in our sources of information, our sense of personal identity, our sense of social status, and I'm sure I could think of many other examples. But trying to talk about authority in a way that forces us to look at that whole large range of ways that people decide what sources of information they're going to trust would, I think, hopefully allow us to address some of these tendencies that we're seeing as a result of post-truth politics.
It's interesting. It's been, let's see, I think it's been almost 5 years since the framework was introduced. Mm-hmm. And the framework really came out right before all of this emerged, and was probably bubbling up, but I believe standards are revisited every 5 years in ACRL. And so we may be on the cusp of a time when there will be an opportunity to re-articulate that frame.
Yes, and I absolutely did notice in my research that, as you said, the framework came out. I think that the initial draft of the frame was written before these things really came to the forefront of the public consciousness. So it's not necessarily that these issues were neglected, but just that we weren't, as a profession, thinking about them then the same way that we are now.
Exactly. Thanks, Stefanie.
Stefanie, for all the reasons that you're pointing out in your responses, we're getting a lot of different kinds of advice and information for what our instruction colleagues should be doing in the classroom as they practice their instruction, to change our practices to help students understand and negotiate and navigate this new post-facts environment. So do you have any specific recommendations, ideas, or suggestions? We've heard things like teach students to triangulate information, teach them to work like fact checkers. Any thoughts on what you would recommend to a colleague who asked you for advice on how they might want to change or tweak their practice in this new environment?
Yeah, I will say that both of the things that you mentioned are things that I have considered, at least to some extent. This is a question that for me is one that I'm in an ongoing process of trying to answer. So I don't think I have fantastic answers yet. I have answers that are in development. One of them actually goes back to what I was talking about with respect to decoupling the notions of credibility and authority. And one of the things I hope to try somewhat this coming school year in my own teaching is to talk a little bit to students about those two concepts and to help them understand that, that those are two slightly different things. And that the way we decide as human beings what sources of information we're going to trust doesn't always correspond to the things that they're learning about how you identify the best source of information. I'm a big fan of using reflection in my teaching. It's also quite a tradition here at Augustana to think about reflection as part of our teaching for students. And so I wonder whether talking about some of those things might open the door for them to ask themselves, how am I deciding which information I trust and what I don't trust? How am I making those decisions? Am I happy with the way I'm making those decisions? Because I'm not sure that all of us very often step back and ask ourselves those questions. Why did I instinctively trust this article that I read, where a part of me was really doubtful about this one? What was actually going on? So encouraging a bit of self-awareness and self-examination. Another thing that occurs to me is actually something that I know a lot of librarians have been talking about, but I just wonder whether it might work pretty well for this particular problem, which is thinking about the way we talk about the contextual nature of authority. And I know that one way of thinking about it is the idea that, say, in one particular circle of people, a particular authority might be recognized and respected, whereas in another circle, that authority may not be recognized or respected. I mean, that's one way of thinking about contextual authority. I think another way of thinking about it is to really encourage students to recognize that they should be granting different levels of authority to sources depending on the circumstances in which they're using those sources. And that could even be true in, say, an academic research paper. A lot of their professors are going to tell them you need to use peer-reviewed sources. And indeed, there are going to be many cases where that source representing expertise, the traditional academic notion of authority is going to be very important, and they'll want to grant that a great deal of authority within their own work. But there might be other circumstances where a drastically different kind of source might be one to which they'll assign a great deal of authority for a very specific purpose. And I wonder whether talking to them in this way could sort of help them move away from this idea that there are good sources and there are bad sources. Because I think a lot of them walk into college thinking that that's going to be the case, or that that's what their professors and librarians will think. And many of them, I think, walk out as well, continuing to think that way. But it doesn't really address the issue of being self-aware about the way we gather information for ourselves and decide what we're going to believe and what we consider to be actionable. So I don't know whether either of those things can, actually address the post-facts mindset, just in the sense that, I'm not sure we can ever really know how our students are making those decisions. But I'm hoping that some small things along those lines can start to move the needle just a little bit to get students to think slightly differently.
Well, you made a couple of great points right in your response that I think any instructor would recognize and relate to, particularly students being more self-reflective, not seeing things as black and white, but there's a lot of gray, and it depends on what's the context in which the information is being used. And these could certainly be opportunities in classrooms to work with instructors to help students think through these difficult evaluation situations where they need to figure out whether something is a valid resource for their college research paper. And I couldn't agree more when I see students, it's like they're kind of programmed to, based on some piece of information, maybe because it's the New York Times, that it's automatically an authority. And so maybe the thing we need to do is just work more to get them to ask questions and feel that it's okay to not know.
Right, I absolutely agree.
That's right. I love that emphasis on reflection also, which is always a critical part of the process and can really help them get started thinking about why did they knee-jerk respond to something a certain way. I was also, I'm working on a book right now. It's coming out in a couple of months through ACRL, and it's about promoting reflective dialogue in times of political polarization. And there's an article, or there's a chapter in that book that was written by Sarah Hartman Caverly that's about dialogue in 4chan, which is like one of those like dark web channels,
Sure.
About the political process. And so 4chan in that chapter was the authoritative source.
Yes.
Even though, you would not be looking to that channel for, reasoned news commentary. In that context, that was the absolute gold standard source. And so having more examples like that, I agree, are going to help students see that, nothing is good or bad. It really depends on the situation.
Yes, that's actually an excellent example of exactly what I was talking about. There will be times when 4chan is the most authoritative source, when Breitbart News is the most authoritative source. But you have to think about
exactly
how you're doing that. Yeah.
So now we want to ask you one more question, Stefanie. First of all, congratulations again. I don't know if there has been another article that has won both the Portal Best Article Award and the Eileen Rockman Award. So that is an awesome achievement and very well deserved. And so building on that, we know that researching and writing an award-winning article like this one must have been a real challenge.
It was.
Writing any article is a real challenge, right? But especially one that has this much of an impact on the profession. And what advice do you have for librarians who may be struggling to finish a research project or an article manuscript?
As I think about the process that I went through of writing this particular article, I think a couple of things occur to me. One of them is the idea that you shouldn't be afraid or reluctant to use writing as a way of figuring out what you think. I think we still often fall into this idea that the way you write a paper or an article is to develop an idea, to do some research, to write an outline, and to write the paper. And to me, that doesn't necessarily always work, particularly if you're trying to work with some really complicated ideas that maybe you yourself don't fully understand when you sit down to write about them, which was certainly the case for me. As those ideas start swirling through your head, it can be a really good idea to just sit down and start writing, even if you feel like you're not ready, because that forces you to connect the dots. And it forces you to recognize the connections that you're not yet making in your argument that might seem really obvious to you, but that you realize are not so obvious once you put them down on paper. So that's one thing. And to go along with that, just being willing to not just write and edit, but rewrite and rewrite. I think there was a passage of about 10 or 12 pages in the middle of the article that I wrote from scratch 3 times. And the reason for it was that the first time I wrote that passage, I was understanding more about my thinking as I went along. And by the time I got to the end of it, I understood a lot of things that I hadn't understood when I started. So I went back and tried to edit, except my understanding had changed so much that editing wasn't really an option. So I rewrote the whole thing and probably used, maybe 3 or 4 or half a dozen sentences from the first time through. And then when I got to the end of it a second time, the exact same thing happened. I went back and wrote it a third time. And it might seem like this is a huge waste of time, possibly. I know it's hard to find the time to do these sorts of things when we're all overwhelmingly busy. But if you are working with complex ideas and you can find the time to do something like that, I think that can only clarify your thinking and improve your argument in the long run.
Do you find that this informs also how you work with students on their own research projects as well, and the kind of advice that you give them about writing?
I think it can, yes, because I have personal examples to give them of a time that I had to write something 3 times, as I just said, before it was in a form that I could send it to a publisher. And certainly one thing I think that I didn't mention just a moment ago is that part of what happened in that rewriting process was going back to my sources, looking at more sources, doing some more reading as I was writing. So it also helps to reinforce the idea that research is an iterative process. So in the sense that I can give students examples of sort of real life research and say, yes, I know this from experience, absolutely, it's something that I can work into my teaching.
But at some point after those several rewrites, which is an interesting way to approach it, it's sort of like when you forget to save something and you lose all of your work and you have to start over. Sometimes what you come up with the second or third time, you realize is actually better. Mm-hmm. But also, how did you know when you were done? Because I think the other thing that writers have a challenge with is not feeling like what they've come up with is perfect enough. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's never going to be done, so they never finish. Did you get a feeling like, okay, I've got it now, it may not be perfect, but I'm going forward with it?
I think so, yes. And I don't know that I can identify the exact moment when that happened. But certainly, after that third time that I wrote those 10 or 12 pages, by the time I got to the end of the third time, I didn't feel like my ideas had changed fully since the start. Mm-hmm. And that was one way to know that I didn't need to write a 4th draft from scratch. Finally, I was actually laying things out as I had come to understand them in the course of my research and writing, instead of learning and discovering new things as I went along, if that makes any sense.
It does. Thanks.
Stefanie, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, sharing your writing process, sharing your pedagogical ideas, all related to your award-winning article today. And To our viewers who are watching today, we also want to say thanks for taking part in Portal Behind the Scenes. If you're interested in more about Portal, follow us on Twitter at Portal Journal for links to future episodes and to other journal news. And so, Stephen, thanks for your time today. Stefanie, thanks, and we will all see you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Stefanie.